But firstly, I just want to say welcome to everybody, and how fantastic it is to see, because back here sitting in Canberra on Ngunnawal Ngambri country, a number of us are getting back into the campus to work, but it's really weird because we're actually all sitting in the same building, but we're still sitting in our room on Zoom. So there's a kind of, transition thing that's happening for everyone, I think, in terms of slowly getting back to work. But Bhiamie and I were just saying how great it is to see everyone joining in from so many different places around Australia, and it is one of the fantastic things that Zoom has made possible for these discussions. And I'm really, really pleased to introduce Bhiamie today. And it's the last in our seminars for this year's series. They'll start again next year, but thank you to everyone who's supported the seminar series this year in coming along and contributing to the conversations that we've had. And just acknowledge, firstly, sitting here in Canberra, the traditional custodians of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the lands on which this university is built, and who also suffered during the local bushfires here in Canberra when they happened, which is the topic that Bhiamie is going to be talking to us about today. So some really quite devastating impacts around this region from the bushfires for traditional owners, as well as the general Canberra population. And also give a shout out to Gumbaynggirr people of owners of the lands on which I live up in Bellingen in New South Wales. So, like I was saying, I'm really thrilled to introduce Bhiamie. How would I describe all of the skills and talents of Bhiamie without totally shame-jobbing him? But they do deserve to be mentioned. Like he's done a Master's in First Nations governance over in British Columbia, in Canada. He's been back in Australia and worked for the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute, running really jam-packed and influential Aboriginal youth masterclasses and webinars. He's currently an associate academic and a PhD scholar at the centre in ANU, and has got an absolute passion, not only in terms of Indigenous men's issues in Australia, but cultural burning and land conservation and management, and has recently written, I think, some really, really influential opinion pieces in the conversation. So having embarrassed him, I'll pass over to Bhiamie to present today. Thanks very much, Bhiamie.
Yeah, thank you, Di. And
sorry,
thank you.
I'll just come back in, and I usually do this, sorry. I'll ask everyone to make sure you keep your mics on mute. We love your babies, and we love your hubby's work coming in to show you how to fix up the laptop connection, but it really distracts speakers when we get a lot of the background noise. So if you keep your mics on mute, and as you're thinking of questions, put them into the chat, and we'll keep an eye on the chat questions that come up later on. And it's only the presentation that will be recorded and podcasted. Sorry about that, Bhiamie.
That's all right. Thank you, Di. Yeah, and I think it's important, that to know for people who are here, and also, people who who would have liked to have made it along but are unable to do so. This is being recorded and will be made available on the Capable website as well. So thank you for that introduction, Di. The higher you put me up, the further I have to fall. So I'll try not to stumble and trip too much. And really, really pleased, and I'm really kind of buzzing to be able to present this seminar today. As Di said, it's a topic that I've been immensely passionate about for a number of years, and really put a lot of time and dedication and research energy into. And so today's presentation is really the culmination of a couple of years worth of work from myself, and just really stoked to be able to deliver this. So And just acknowledging yourself, Di, and also colleagues that I've seen a couple from the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute. So this paper and this presentation is being delivered in partnership between the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute and CAPA in the Indigenous Governance and Development Project. So just honouring that partnership and that research project, and thank our colleagues at AIGI for supporting this. Yeah, and it's really nice. I've been scrolling through a few of the names and seeing people put where they're joining from, and there's former teachers, former students, my sister's in here, and a lot of colleagues and whatnot, as well as a lot of people who I haven't met before. So hello to everyone, and I hope this is definitely worth at least an hour of your time over your lunch period. So this session is till 1:30, so my presentation I've tried to time for about 45 minutes. And then really just keen to jump into some questions and some discussion with the group as well. If you have questions, please put it in the chat function as you go, but Di will be managing questions at the end too. So yeah, I'll jump in. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll kick this party off. Okay, so hopefully that's come up on everyone's screen. So yeah, the title of the presentation is Aboriginal Community Governance in the Black Summer bushfires. I'd just like to start by acknowledging country. So all the countries that everyone's on, in particular Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in Canberra, the ACT, where I work at the ANU and where this is being hosted. I myself am joining from Ngurumba out here in Gadooga up in northwest New South Wales where I live. So this is Yuwalia country, and then this is my grandmother's country up here. And it's a great thrill to be able to be supported to work at the ANU, but live out on country and raise my kids out here. And also just acknowledging my mother, who comes from Cloncurry, and her mother, who comes from Normanton, up in the Gulf country, up in Queensland. So a lot of family on the mother's side going up into Gulf of Carpentaria. Yeah, so the outline for the presentation today will be broadly along these four themes, these four areas. So the first one, we'll just go through a bit of the methods and the background for the academics in the room, because they'll take me a little more seriously if I'm able to substantiate how I've done this work. And then go into sort of some background on Aboriginal people in the Black Summer bushfires. And that background will then lead straight into a discussion of some of the experiences of Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities in the bushfires. And then from those experiences, we can jump into a conversation on what was the response to, oh, sorry for that typo, it's up late last night fixing this up, but the response by Aboriginal community groups and organisations. And then finally, we'll finish by considering the lessons learned from the disaster. But before we jump into the methods and the background, I first do want to take a moment to acknowledge and honour all those people who were impacted by the bushfires. Of course, whilst they have become popularly known as the Black Summer bushfires, the event itself started way back at the end of winter in 2019 and stretched right through to the autumn of 2020. It was truly an extraordinary thing to live through, and it caused so many people deep suffering, loss, and heartbreak. So this is also a good time to also warn people that some of the content of this presentation some people might find disturbing and confronting, and I'm sure that many people, especially Aboriginal people joining in this presentation is likely to bring up some, traumatic memories associated with the events of that summer. So if you need, please take a moment, turn the volume off, walk away, or sign out altogether and come back and tune back in when you're ready to engage with this topic through the recording. And so I think it's important that we all practice that care for one another, and just acknowledge that, it's okay not to be okay. So please just keep that in mind. So first, to touch on the methods used in this paper. So this presentation does come from a paper that is going to be released in the next little while through CAPA as a discussion paper. So the methods are used in this study. The primary method used was content analysis. So for those unfamiliar, content analysis is used to distill various texts, including reports, things like reports, transcripts, submissions, interviews, and even things like social media posts and emails, and use these to identify themes. And so one can make inferences as to events, attitudes, and social commentary. Of course, over the period of December 2019 to January 2020 in particular, the bushfires garnered international attention. Quite simply, it was the biggest story in the world. The coverage and ensuring and the resulting commissions, royal commissions and independent inquiries resulted in a proliferation of material covering the disaster, and it is from these resources that I have gathered and organised the following. But a talk only of the method would be incomplete without engaging with one's standpoint. So this is really important.
This is time she's going to get smashed with bass if she.
Could just remind people to mute. Sorry. Yeah. So we can't just talk about methodology, because the fact is, in some like content analysis, the two, you can give two different people the same material and they might make two different conclusions, draw two different conclusions from the same source material. And so it's necessary to engage with one standpoint with this research method in particular. And so with that, it's important for me to place myself in this research context and in the context of this particular endeavour. That way kind of contextualises some of the conclusions drawn and some of the interpretations made about the material. So during the bushfires, I lived in Queensland with my wife and our then 1-year-old son. We were directly affected by a number of fires, including the Katangle fire in a forest just outside of Bungendore, the Beard fire between Canberra Airport and Queanbeyan, and also, of course, the Aurora Valley mega fire in the south of Canberra. During the Beard fire, we were evacuated from our house because, for those of you familiar with Queanbeyan, so we lived up near Toppy, up near Top Pub, which was the area of real concern during that bushfire event. So it was a fast-moving grass fire, and it came from the airport straight over into sort of like the area that is Oaks Estate, and I really worried about it jumping the rail lines over into Queanbeyan. So as a result, we were evacuated, and my wife, my son and I went over and stayed at my sister's house in Canberra, actually, and Sister Leonie's joining. So hello, Leonie. But this evacuation, so we were evacuated for one night because of the fire itself, but then we stayed evacuated for up to a week later because the Beard fire actually got into a waste facility in the industrial area right next to Oaks Estate, and it was spewing really, toxic kind of gases, from that waste facility. And people in Queanbeyan were advised to stay indoors and not go out as much as insofar as possible during that period, which is pretty full on. But it wasn't the evacuation from our house that was the most frightening event or moment in the crisis for us as a family. So on New Year's Eve 2019, so in the period of sort of that late December period was when the Talaganda State Fire out of Bungendore was really taking off and was burning out of control. And it was fanned by really hot, strong westerly winds. New Year's Eve 2019, so 31 December, there was a wind change. There was a cool easterly that blew over, which was welcome relief to emergency services trying to control that fire. It gave them a moment of rest, of reprieve, for them to put in containment lines and try to manage that fire event. So whilst it was really good for the emergency services, what it resulted in was that of like the pushing of all of the smoke from sending it out over the coast and over the ocean, it pushed it straight back into Queanbeyan and into Canberra. And for people with good memories, that was one of the first real big, thick blanketing smoke events. The big smoke haze that landed over Canberra came in on 31 December. So that evening, our son, Daramulin, started experiencing breathing difficulties as a result of the smoke. So he's always had trouble with his lungs on account of him being a preemie baby. And when my wife noticed his work of breathing, we took him to Queanbeyan Hospital. So this is how we spent our New Year's 2019 and 20 with our little guy on oxygen in emergency in Queanbeyan Hospital. He's just an absolute trooper. We got there and the nurse gave him a lollipop and this little cape that we put on. And so for that night, he was Super Dara. He was our little superhero. But the action didn't stop there. So while we were actually in the hospital, the smoke really came into town and actually made into the hospital. All the smoke alarms went off in the hospital, which was a bit which is a bit how you're going, and cause a lot of confusion and a lot of anxiety within the hospital itself. And so because the smoke came in, they actually had to put him on oxygen, on assisted breathing during that. So the next day, we actually made the decision to leave Queanbeyan and Canberra, and we travelled to Wollongong. And thankfully for us, we had a place to evacuate to. And at that time, the road to Wollongong was just about the only place that you could drive, because of all the fires and the roads being closed everywhere else. But we went to Wollongong and stayed with my wife's family, basically just to escape the fire, because we didn't want to put any, you know, we wanted to look after the little guy and his breathing in particular. So we self-evacuated down to Wollongong, which of course was experiencing smoke haze, but nowhere near to the levels of Canberra at that time. So this is just to say that for me, I'm not, nor could be, nor would I want to be considered an independent observer of these events. The fact is that the bushfires of 2019-20 was such an extraordinary event. I would contest whether anyone could consider themselves an independent observer. I think what Australia and people internationally as well experienced was a sense of shock and cultural trauma. And that's a cultural and social trauma, I think, that we all share, which is some of the reasons why people still really struggle with this event. And even now, 2 years later, it's still really difficult to grasp the magnitude and severity of what happened over that period. Furthermore, as a member of the Aboriginal community in Canberra and Queanbeyan, and it's a large Aboriginal community, and it extends right down in particular to the south coast of New South Wales and into the mountain areas, in areas like Brungle, Tumut, and also down to Albury, Wodonga. And we all talk to one another embedded in that community, and so we all are aware of the things that people go through and the challenges that people experience. We hear it through all of our social connections. And so this is all to say that the interpretation and inferences made from the materials that we'll shortly be going through accord with what we know, certainly what I know to be true, embedded within those social and cultural networks through that area, as well as obviously the personal story of how we were affected during the bushfires as well. For making sense of this study and of the conclusions drawn. So jumping into some of the background material now, and the place I'd like to start is by considering some of the policy documentation, the policy context of disaster management and planning and preparation in Australia. So people, and I'm sure there are people in here who, from the emergency management and also disaster resilience and disaster planning sectors, they'd be really familiar with these kinds of documents. So the national one is the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience, and then that's one of the peak national key policy documents. And then you've got the state documents. So you've got the New South Wales State Emergency Management Plan, and in Victoria, you've also got the Victorian Emergency Management Strategic Action Plan. With the Victorian one in this instance, so that's a 2016-19 plan. They have since updated that plan. But at the time that this event happened, this was the plan of operation in Victoria. So these are just three. There's a lot more, but these are just three that are really pivotal in guiding disaster planning and preparation throughout New South Wales and Victoria, and the ACT as well in particular. So examining these documents and others reveals that there is scarce mention of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, including adjacent terms such as Indigenous, culture, cultural heritage, land rights, native title, discrete communities, and so on. Aboriginal people are completely and despicably absented from these key policy documents, and which is really significant because they form the infrastructure of disaster planning throughout Australia. The only policy document that I've come across that addresses the unique issues relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia is this one. So this is the guide to risk management in Queensland, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So this was developed in 2004 by the Queensland Government. this is actually quite a good policy. So quite a good report that was developed. It says quite a lot of good things and foundational things, and certainly points to some key areas of concern and challenges that need policy attention. But there is very little I've seen very little evidence of its integration into the larger disaster and emergency planning since 2004 when it was developed. So it's a fantastic document, but it is 17 years old, and I'm yet to see evidence of how it was, kind of subsumed and made a part of the apparatus of disaster planning in Queensland or Australia. So this is the Queensland one. The study that I've done here focuses primarily though on New South Wales, the ACT and Victoria. And the ACT includes Jervis Bay Territory. So they were the kind of the jurisdictions that were the focus of this particular study. But this Queensland document is the only policy document that I've come across in Australia, which is why it's worth mentioning. Had there been engagement with Aboriginal people in any of these planning documents, the ones that would have been put in place. So in the jurisdictions that I said, New South Wales, the ACT and Victoria, there are distinct features of Aboriginal communities that I would say are relevant for disaster planning, or more relevant than others. First of all is the population. So New South Wales in particular has a very large Aboriginal population, the largest in the country. And Victoria has quite a large Aboriginal population, but the Aboriginal population of Victoria is also unevenly spread throughout different areas of the state. And it just so happens that the areas with high fire threat are areas where you have high populations of Aboriginal people. This resulted in the fire event itself, the Black Summer bushfires, or that whole series of fires, resulted in the direct impacts on some 96,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As a proportion of the population, it represents approximately 12% of the entire population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, with the largest cohort of people affected being infants and young children, owing to the unique demographic profile of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations. There are also significant risk factors, such as overcrowded and multi-generational households, poor health of residents, the lack of appropriate infrastructure, lack of appropriate transport, and poor access roads to discrete communities. There exists a significant extent of land rights throughout these jurisdictions, in particular New South Wales through the Land Rights Act and governed by local Aboriginal land councils, and in Victoria there's an Aboriginal Lands Act as well, and federal lands returned through the Federal Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation. And finally, there are significant cultural and heritage rights possessed by traditional owner groups in these jurisdictions. These are recognised through, obviously, the Federal Native Title Act, but also state-based mechanisms as well. For instance, in Victoria, there's the Registered Aboriginal Parties through the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act, and then also the Traditional Owner Settlement Act. And these acts and these rights, recognise the rights of Aboriginal people to access, enjoy and utilise the resources on their country. So these are all really important features of the Aboriginal populations in these areas that should have formed, a really core part of disaster planning. Unfortunately, there was no planning. And so the resultant experiences resulting from some of these features and others are, as I'm sure people have already heard previously in commentary, but we've got to go through now carefully. So the next section will read from various sources that speak directly to the experience of Aboriginal people. So what I've gotten, and you'll see from the source material, there's a lot of media reporting where they engaged and they spoke to Aboriginal people, and their quotes are included. There's a lot of submissions that were made by peak Aboriginal organisations, they're included. There's a lot of media releases by peak Aboriginal organisations, and they're included. And they've included also findings from reports and inquiries in different states. And so that's what we're going to go through now. So starting with the South Coast Aboriginal Women's and Health Welfare Aboriginal Corporation, or submissions, or submission by Nacho that they lend voice to. Waminda, located in Nowra, advised that during the bushfire crisis, that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the region were not able to access evacuation services and supplies. Waminda reported that some who tried were treated badly. And I will read out each of these quotes because I think it's really important to give it that time and space to read visually and to hear, you know, to hear through your ears as well. This is from Gippsland and East Gippsland Aboriginal Community Cooperative, also known as GJAC, and they stated, transport of community members quickly became an issue as many community members did not have access to vehicles and the services had limited transport options during the crisis. Katangle Aboriginal Health Service down on the far south coast. So they conducted a mental health assessment needs of community members in that area. They were the only ones to conduct that assessment. And in that assessment process, they went to non-Indigenous staff members at evacuation centres who were staffed by NGO staff, like Binnies and the Red Cross and that kind of thing. And they asked them if they collected Indigenous status, because how else would you know how many Aboriginal people you were treating or you were supporting at the evacuation centres? And this was the response when they asked if these organisations collected Indigenous status. They said it was racist to ask Indigenous status and that everyone should be treated the same, or we are all equal. So plainly, no one was collecting in, very few people in organisations were collecting information, collecting data on Indigenous status, which makes it very difficult to target resources and support communities, obviously. One of the more well-known accounts was reported by Channel 10, who spoke to an elder in East Gippsland trying to access an evacuation centre. When they arrived, they were shocked and saddened to hear a staff member say to them, point blank, "We've helped enough of you people today." This is from the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, NACCHO. They collected anecdotal evidence that there was a lack of support provided to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples during and after the emergency, including experiences of racism and discrimination when evacuating and accessing emergency support and supplies, including at evacuation centres. These experiences were heard and acknowledged by Dave Owens and Maria O'Kane, who led the New South Wales Independent Inquiry in the bushfires. In their final report, they observed that the inquiry acknowledges that Aboriginal communities across the state were greatly affected by the bushfires. The inquiry was disappointed to learn that in some communities, Aboriginal people felt unwelcome at evacuation centres, and in some cases, support services were reluctant to provide immediate relief. These experiences compounded the trauma they had already experienced as a result of the bushfires, and in some cases led to people putting themselves at risk as they feared how they would be treated. But it wasn't just the social elements of the disaster that was uniquely distressing for Aboriginal people. The devastation inflicted upon the land had an element of cultural trauma. So this is a section from an article published by Indigenous Affairs editor and a countrywoman of mine, Lorena Allam. She stated, "Like you, I've watched in anguish and horror as fire lays waste to precious Yuin land, taking everything with it, lives, homes, animals, trees. But for First Nations people, it is also burning up our memories, our sacred places, all the things which make us who we are. It's a particular grief to lose forever what connects you to a place in the landscape. Our ancestors felt it, our elders felt it, and now we are feeling it." This is a ranger, an Aboriginal ranger down in Mogo, through the Mogo Local Aboriginal Land Council, who in an interview with an ABC South Coast reporters was speaking about the devastation and how she felt. And she said, "Being so connected with the land through my work and my ancestry, I'm grieving for the plants, the animals, the birds." This is from a submission by the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council to the Independent Inquiry in New South Wales, where they stated, "We also wish to highlight the mental health impacts on Aboriginal communities as a result of the recent bushfires. This trauma has been amplified by the fact that important cultural and sacred sites, homes and livelihoods have been destroyed. Country, trees, plants and animals are intensely significant to Aboriginal people as a conduit for connecting traditional custodians to their culture, country, law and ancestors. As such, any damage to country causes an immense sense of grief." It's not only Aboriginal organisations, our peak organisations that were saying this stuff and acknowledging it. This is from the Australian Red Cross submission to the Bushfire Inquiry in New South Wales. The Red Cross acknowledges the intrinsic connection Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have to their country and the unique pain and impacts felt as a result of natural disasters and emergencies. All of these experiences were acknowledged then in Victoria in their 2019-20 Victorian Government Aboriginal Affairs report. In that report on page 12, they state that Aboriginal people are disproportionately affected by the impacts of the fires due to existing structural and financial inequalities, a backdrop of historical and intergenerational trauma, and the significant impacts that bushfires and bushfire protection has on country and cultural heritage. I think that this was a significant inclusion in the Victorian Government report, because it's for the first time you start to see in government's own reports the acknowledgement of structural inequalities that produce vulnerabilities in Aboriginal populations, the historical factors that have led to those vulnerabilities and those and discrimination, and also significantly that it's not just the bushfires that are a hazard for Aboriginal people, but for the response by emergency services agencies and what they do to the land in efforts to protect lives and properties. So the last quote in this first section is from Trevor Pearce, who was the acting CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation at the time the bushfires hit, because Jill Gallagher was the Treaty Commissioner. She was taking as a comment over as a Treaty Commissioner at that time. But in their media release, this is him being quoted, stating that the large-scale displacement of Aboriginal people and families in these regions and the impact of this on well-being of communities and the concurrent expectations of community organisations cannot be understated. And so it's with this one that we just take a moment to catch our breath and then turn our eyes to the response of community organisations, because this here was the first real acknowledgement that I've seen of that not only was the task immense, but the expectation of who would respond to that challenge was our community organisations, who, as we're about to find out, are not resourced to provide these services. But before we go to the response of our organisations, just taking a moment, as I said, to take stock and take a breath and see what we've learned from considering some of their testimony. That there's a few key lessons for me that jump out that are immediate. That Aboriginal people were not well supported during and post the bushfire emergency. Secondly, Aboriginal people experienced a unique trauma associated with racism and discrimination and damage to the land. Emergency management agencies and non-government organisations were ill-equipped to support Aboriginal communities during the emergency. There are unresolved issues of data collection and sharing of data to identify Aboriginal individuals being evacuated in an emergency. There are historical and unresolved legacies of colonisation, and that these produce vulnerabilities in times of disaster. And finally, that social inequalities place Aboriginal people at additional risk in times of disaster. There are many things to garner from considering, we've just kind of considered, but these are, as I said, some immediate ones that jump out and some immediate learnings that I think have a transformative potential in how governments and NGOs who are involved in this work what they can start to do to address the shortcomings in their responses and their planning. But the fact is that Aboriginal people did make it through the bushfires, and so someone had to support them. And during that event, the main support fell on our own community organisations. So to look at the response by community groups, we'll consider the next little section. So this is from the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, again in their submission. Aboriginal community organisations were working on the ground to respond to the bushfire crisis, providing vital assistance and guidance to Aboriginal people and communities, including health, housing, food and mental health supports. The role of Aboriginal community organisations was and continues to be vital in providing and coordinating responses. From GJAC, again in East Gippsland, GJAC was under considerable pressure during the bushfire crisis. The service opened its doors to the community as surrounding townships were ordered to evacuate and provided food and shelter to evacuees. This is again from Waminda. To support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the area affected by the bushfires, Waminda purchased and supplied emergency items such as torches, batteries, portable stoves, gas cylinders, sleeping bags, eskies, sanitary items, wipes, nappies, fresh food, petrol and water. These supplies were purchased by Waminda by redirecting existing funding. No additional funding was allocated. From the Firesticks Alliance, Aboriginal Corporation, they acknowledge that many Aboriginal communities' lives, assets and cultural values were threatened or impacted by recent fire seasons. Greater support for Indigenous-led community-controlled bushfire response capacity and capability is critical to combat future emergencies and natural disasters. Current resourcing and mechanisms are often disempowering and do not support Aboriginal community needs and values. From Katangle, on the far south coast of New South Wales, Katangle staff were both victims as well as first responders to the bushfire crisis. This is a really important point, because in disaster planning and preparation, what we see in the way programs are designed to prepare for disasters is that we see a lot of attention paid to, and I guess the separation of people who are directly affected or victims or evacuees and primary responders. In the context of Aboriginal community organisations and Aboriginal communities, they are the same thing. They are community-run organisations. They are staffed by community members, which means that when they are called upon to respond to a disaster, the staff themselves are direct victims of this. And if it's not them directly, it is their family. This has enormous consequences for the training of staff and the kind of support that staff will need to manage their own mental health and their own well-being during the crisis. This was acknowledged again in the Nacho submission. As Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations are local organisations, staffed and controlled by the community in which they operate, staff were directly affected by the bushfires. In some cases, their homes were directly threatened. Staff holidays and normal shutdown procedures over the Christmas and New Year holidays had to be abandoned, and clinical staff worked under the risk of burnout and increasingly stretched resources. So we've just spoken a lot about the community-controlled health organisations and about the response. You can consider like a social response to the emergency and supporting people in their very immediate needs, things like food, water, shelter, communications, petrol to drive to evacuate, where obviously in some instances people had to drive many hundreds of kilometres to evacuate, those kinds of things. But there was also a response by Aboriginal organisations that can be considered somewhat differently. And that is of the registered cultural heritage groups or native title groups and the prescribed bodies corporate, or in Victoria, the registered Aboriginal parties. So in East Gippsland, this is one such example from the Gunai Kurnai Lands and Waters Aboriginal Corporation, who are the recognised native title holders and traditional custodians of vast areas of lands in East Gippsland in Victoria. So they are, as I said, recognised as native title holders, and they also have a settlement agreement. So in 2003, there was significant alpine bushfires that devastated a lot of Gunai Kurnai country. So during that event in 2003, a great many number of cultural heritage sites were damaged or destroyed. Most of this damage, however, was not a result of the fires themselves. Rather, they were the result of the actions of emergency services to make townships and assets safe. Things like creating fire breaks, the dumping of a lot of water, of the fire retardant and things like that. So these actions to make safe communities, townships and assets in that fire event, the Alpine fires in 2003, actually damaged us or destroyed a significant amount of cultural heritage of Gunai Kurnai people. As a result of this event, 16 years before 2019, when this fire disaster occurred, the Gunai Kurnai Lands and Waters Aboriginal Corporation, the traditional owner corporation representing the interests of Gunai Kurnai people, organised for a number of Gunai Kurnai rangers to complete bushfire awareness training. This meant that in any future fire event, they were qualified to be present on the fire ground. Further, senior staff within GLOAC, which is just the acronym of the organisation, made significant efforts to establish relationships with emergency management staff and integrate the organisation as much as possible within emergency management structures, such as through IMTs or incident management teams. This was viewed as a high priority for GLOAC, as the legal arrangements in disasters mean that in response to a disaster, such as a bushfire, legislation permits emergency management authorities to destroy or damage cultural heritage sites. The result of these efforts was that in the bushfires of 2019-20, which impacted significant areas of Gunai Kurnai country, cultural heritage officers from GLOAC were permitted to work with emergency crews, such as walking in front of vehicles to identify scarred trees or other cultural heritage values. The result of these efforts and this careful and methodical planning and preparation by Gunai Kurnai people and their organisation meant that more than 100 cultural heritage sites, more than 100, so not 100, many more, were identified and made safe during the response to the bushfires. I think it's an extraordinary effort and testament to that organisation in particular, and therefore the learned lessons from previously and the preparation and planning that they put in themselves, and the relationships they established with emergency management agencies and staff, so that they were in this position. It was a fantastic outcome and shows the leadership of that organisation in particular. There is another example of this kind of work, and that is in Western Victoria, and the Guntitj Mara people at the Bhiamie Cultural Landscape. So this is Uncle Dennis Rose, who I'm sure some people in here will be familiar with. So Uncle Dennis is a good, I consider him a mentor of mine. He's a wonderful person, and he is a very senior cultural authority in Guntitj Mara country and a very eminent community leader. So this Uncle Dennis, this is him providing testimony to the Royal Commission International Natural Disaster Arrangements. It's all public. You can go on, and I'd recommend, if you have an extra 30 minutes, listen to his evidence. It's just breathtaking, the knowledge that he has, and also how he talks through the event and then the response by himself and then also Guntitj Mara people. So in his extensive evidence, he reflected on the time he spent within the incident management team, the IMT, managing the bushfire that threatened much of Bhiamie. And so Bhiamie is a UNESCO-listed cultural heritage site. It's recognised for its outstanding cultural values. In particular, its stone huts and eel traps that are still there. The advice provided by Uncle Dennis about the cultural heritage values of the landscape to Gunditjmara people, as well as someone with a keen and intimate knowledge of the landscape, proved critical in designing a fire containment strategy. So basically, there are no laws that require cultural heritage groups to be within IMTs in response to disasters. Uncle Dennis has a long history of being a ranger. He's very familiar and has worked within emergency management structures. He has been trained significantly over his career in fire management and responded to a number of fires himself. As such, he is aware and is very knowledgeable about what is required and what to expect, and how people in the chain of commands, all of these things. And he's also very well respected in not just the Indigenous community in that area of Victoria, but in the non-Indigenous community as well. He's a very eminent leader. And so when a fire came through earlier in the fire season in 2019, he was invited and welcomed into the incident management team, and he actually sat as, I guess, an unofficial member of the incident management team. He talks about this in his evidence. Because he was there, he was at the table when decisions were made, he was at the table when strategies were being developed. He was able to advise on things like mineral earth containment lines, which was suggested, and he said, no, the land is lava soil and lava flow, and it'll be really difficult to create mineral earth containment lines. And so they changed strategy and were able to design, a network of soft containment lines using fire retardant and drops, and also natural assets like water holes in creeks and that kind of thing, and the ones that had water in, which he could advise on. He also advised them on recent land management activity where land had been cleared, recent cultural burns that had been conducted. He also was able to advise on the existence of cultural heritage sites, both on the register and cultural heritage sites that the community chose not to put on the register. And this is so important in emergency responses, that they go to the cultural heritage register and they look at the cultural heritage sites on there, and they do not engage with any cultural heritage sites that community may not want to put onto that register for whatever reason. But he was able to communicate that. And so he was also able to advise on things like where not to drop water and retardant because of these system of traps and the stone arrangements throughout the entire landscape. So all of this is to say that he provided timely, critical, and vital information that supported emergency services to develop what they considered an effective strategy to contain the fire and to control the fire so that it didn't escape and get into nearby townships. And the wonderful thing is, it worked. They contained the fire. They limited the damage. Only a number of sites were damaged, and that damage was minor from the reduced intensity of the fire because of the work they'd done previously. This is an example where, cultural heritage organisations and emergency management agencies have worked together, can work together for a really positive outcome. As I said, with GLOAC, this isn't legally required. And I think that's a point for people who are interested in policy, advocating for policy change. I think that's something that is on the horizon and should be advocated strongly, that Aboriginal cultural heritage groups must be within incident management teams in formulating response to disasters. But these two examples are to also show the role of traditional owner corporations, PBCs and the like, and RAPs in Victoria, and local Aboriginal land councils in New South Wales in assisting and adding value to the responses in emergencies, and the safeguarding, the critical information they offer on country, on climate, on recent land management activities, on strategic assets, natural assets in the landscape, things like mountain ridges or creeks or rivers. Some rivers might be dry, some rivers might be full. They would know all of this stuff. All of these data are so incredibly valuable when formulating responses to fires. And at the moment, it's a missing resource within IMTs across the country. But this is a best practice example, and like I said, it's all public. Use it. So what have we learnt from all of this? A couple of things. First of all, Aboriginal community organisations are an asset in times of disaster. So Aboriginal community organisations are governed by their communities. This means that firstly, they provide critical information about local populations, such as distribution, families, visitors, health of local people, number and locations of elders, mobility, avoidance relationships, and more. And avoidance relationships is really critical in evacuations. There are stories coming out in some communities of a single bus being sent to pick up community members. And in at least one of those communities that I'm aware of, there was someone who was subject to an AVO, and so someone could not get on that bus. Things like that. Secondly, there is a level of trust or at least familiarity between Aboriginal people and organisations. This means that Aboriginal community members are more likely to access these organisations before they access non-Indigenous organisations and government agencies. Another lesson is that communities need sufficient resourcing to provide services. Aboriginal organisations must have the financial capability to support communities, including buying supplies, providing emergency housing, transport, health needs, food, water, and communications. They also need the financial ability to pay staff for their time, including the inevitable overtime and hazard pay. The number of instances of Aboriginal staff in these organisations working for no pay over this particular event is astounding. But additional funding in and of itself may be insufficient. Organisations would require a significant investment of resources, including physical infrastructure, backup generators, vehicles, and IT systems to function in high pressure and volatile environments. Additional training would be required for staff to ensure they have the requisite skills. Taken together, the increase in funding, additional resources, and targeted training would create a surge capacity that currently does not exist within Aboriginal organisations, and these can be called upon in times of disaster. Indigenous data, to ensure that accurate and timely information is being collected and shared in order to target resources and support communities. The collection of data on Indigenous status for people impacted by disasters must be standardised and collected. It must be done. But there are issues with Indigenous data and the mistreatment and misinterpretations of Indigenous data, and so you'd need to overlay the collection of this data with the Indigenous data governance arrangements. Finally, emergency planning, management and response. Traditional owner corporations provide important information regarding country, such as recent land management activities, that may impact on fire spread and severity. They can also advise on landscape features that can be an asset, cultural heritage values, cultural resources important to the community, wildlife populations, including locations of threatened species, threatened or endangered plants or trees, climate, topography, fuel loads, soil, and more. These data are incredibly valuable in formulating strategies and responses to emergencies such as bushfires. So a lot needs to be done. And I'd suggest that the next disaster is too late. Whether Aboriginal cultural heritage or relief and recovery, it is clear that so much needs to be done to better support communities, Aboriginal people during and post disasters. Rather than wait for the next disaster, the time to address these shortcomings is now. And so thank you for listening to that, I'm sure what would have felt like a bit of a whirlwind presentation. And I'll just, thank you all for coming along and for listening and taking an interest, and open it up for some discussion and questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bhiamie. That was really compelling information, especially the voices of organisations and people going through the experience. And I have to say, it totally resonates with the work in the project we were doing around community organisations governing during the pandemic and being left out of arrangements, left out of resourcing, but also being on the front foot at the local level. So I'm just wondering, everybody, if you, I know that there are going to be lots of questions. We've got over 80 people. We had like up to 96 by me listening to your presentation.